I'm here. Like I said, I can't talk too well, guys.
Peter.
So welcome, Tony. Look forward to meeting you in person sometime soon.
Thank you. Likewise.
Welcome, guys from Hopkins. I'm the president, as of recently, I guess, of the Baltimore Babe Ruth chapter. If you guys want to reach out to me and get on our email list, I'll put my email in the chat and I could add you to our list. I'm gonna let John do a quick introduction because my voice is killing me. I'm getting over sinusitis. So hopefully I'll see you guys sometime during the season. I'll be monitoring and yell if you need anything.
Okay, thank you, Peter. I'm going to introduce Tony, and then he'll talk a little bit about his baseball experiences, and then introduce the students, and they will present. Tony is the executive director of Johns Hopkins Information Security Institute and an associate research scientist in computer science at Johns Hopkins. He's got quite an extensive background in that area, but that's not why we're here tonight, not to hear about cyber intelligence and all that kind of good stuff. We're here to talk about baseball. And I got involved with Tony because last summer, he presented at the SABR Zoom convention. And we connected after that, and I worked with him on some of the students. He oversees students' projects and analytics in all sports, but we're specifically interested in baseball tonight. So I'll just turn this thing over to Tony. Tony, take it away.
Thank you, John and Peter, and thank you all for being here this evening. It's my pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to present the work that some of the students in our sports analytics research group at Johns Hopkins have been working on. So I have 3 of those students here tonight: Tad Berkery, Justin Nam, and Jack Pausick. They'll be speaking in a moment. I'm going to share my screen and give you a little bit of the big picture so you have some context. Let me put it in presentation mode, hopefully. Okay, are you able to just see the large screen? Is that working okay?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay,
I think
great.
We can see the speaker notes as well. I don't know if that's
presenter mode that is showing.
Yeah, it's in presenter mode. Okay, well, okay, I don't have any notes, so it should be okay. So a little bit about our group. And before I start, I just want to share kind of a sad moment. I just came from our local minor league ballpark, the Hagerstown Suns. I said sort of a sad farewell. They're knocking down our minor league ballpark any day now. They were auctioning off seats. I was the co-owner of the team for 10 years and had the distinct pleasure of working out with the team for the last 20 years. So some big changes. The good news is that the state of Maryland is funding an Atlantic League team to come in, maybe not next season, but the following season with a new ballpark downtown. But still, this is a 90-year-old ballpark with quite a love story with the city of Hagerstown. A lot of history, including Willie Mays' first professional at bat, Bryce Harper's first professional bat. So a lot of years spanned there. So the Johns Hopkins University Sports Analytics Research Group, I launched in 2012, starting out with baseball scheduling research. And this follows on some work that I did starting in the mid-90s for Major League Baseball. Those of you who fondly remember Katie Feeney, who was responsible for scheduling, among other things, at the MLB level. I worked with her when I was with Motorola and stationed at MIT. And then I did the South Atlantic League schedule for several years. So Professor Fishkind and I in applied math got together, and I'll talk more about scheduling later on, time permitting. We grew that effort so that by 2019, we were scheduling the majority of the affiliated minor leagues and several independent leagues and we were also doing the umpire crew schedules as well. I started the baseball analytics projects around 2014, not only baseball, but also football. We currently have hockey and soccer projects as well. And the group has built relationships with the Orioles and the Ravens. And I'm also happy to say that we've placed graduates of the program in permanent jobs or internships with the Orioles, the Nationals, the Braves, the Marlins, and Major League Advance as well. So I'm pleased that our work has an impact on the careers of our students and doing things that they really love. Here are some of the projects that we're working. These are the baseball related projects that are currently underway. I won't go into details. If you see something that seems interesting to you, you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to give you more details and even put you in touch with the students. We're going to be highlighting 3 of those projects this evening. Tad and Justin are going to be talking about a project that they did with the Baltimore Orioles. Jack is going to be talking about a project that he and I have been working on for a couple of years that I think is very interesting, on something I've been doing for decades, and I finally had a chance to formalize it thanks to Jack, on sign stealing, legal sign stealing, no trash cans involved. And then finally, I'll talk about some outfield positioning optimization work that I've been doing, with some interesting anecdotes involving the Mets. So with that, I think at this point, before I go into my part, I'd like to turn it over to Jack to talk about sign stealing. Just a quick intro for Jack. He's a senior at Hopkins, majoring in applied math and economics. He's been working on sports analytics projects with me since his freshman year. He's also a 4-year member of the Johns Hopkins varsity baseball team. And I'm happy to say that he's crushing it. I don't like to give him too much praise because I'm superstitious. So I'm the Earl Weaver kind of mentality. If you're doing really well, then I criticize you. If you're terrible, then I tell you you're great in hopes that you will be great. His interest is in baseball statistics and sabermetrics, and he hopes to pursue a career in analytics or data science. He grew up in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he's an avid Nationals and Virginia sports fan. Jack, tell us about sign stealing.
All right. Thank you, Dr. D, for the introduction. I'll go ahead and share my presentation. Hopefully you all can see that. Please let me know if you can't. But as Dr. D mentioned, our project is titled A Strong Information Theoretic Bound for Providing Secure Signs in Baseball. And it's something that we've been working on for a couple of years. I think, as Dr. D mentioned, its genesis was kind of an interest that Dr. Dahbura had, where he thought, he had a knack for picking up some of the teams that the Suns would play, picking up some of their signs. And so what we sought out to do was kind of formalize this process of decoding the other team's signs. And hopefully this presentation will provide kind of a high-level overview of some of the work we've done and some of the results, as well as what we're continuing work on now. And so the project goals are to formalize the process of sign transmission and stealing into a game that we can analyze. And so by a game, we really mean a framework that has actors, each with their own objectives and parameters that we're able to change and tweak when we were working on developing our bound. And so after we had established kind of a bound for a relatively simplified version of the game, we sought to sort of loosen some of the simplifying assumptions that we had made earlier on, an example of which is errors committed during the giving and receiving of sign stealing that I'll talk about a little later. And then we have written a paper that presents our simplified bound, sort of proves it mathematically, and then discusses its applications to sign stealing strategy, although that is that paper is still a work in progress, and we've been working on submitting it to a couple of different journals and conferences. But I'll start by trying to describe the game to you all. There are two teams. The first team is the sender and the receiver, and you can think of that as being really a coach and a player, right? The third base coach typically gives signs, and then either the base runners or the batters will interpret them, and then hopefully carry out whatever instructions that the signs had. And so they're transmitting a sequence that is a certain number of signs, and these tend to be touches, right? Like maybe touching your face, the brim of your hat. And some of them contain meaning to the receiver. And as the observer, which should be someone in the other dugout, for example, the goal is to determine which of these signs carry which meaning with respect to a particular action. So maybe a bunt or a steal. And as the first team, their objective is to maximize the number of sequences that can be transmitted before what we like to call unambiguously useful information about the sign system can be obtained. And so I'll try to describe that now. There are two different types of unambiguously useful information, or UUI as I'll refer to it. The first is the strongest, and that basically says that I know exactly which sign maps to the action of interest. Therefore, I always know when a certain play is on and when it is not. So if I know the steal sign, I can tell you before every pitch whether the steal will occur and whether it won't. And obviously, as the opposing team, that gives me, a significant competitive advantage. And then we have weak UUI, which is more on a pitch by pitch basis. So I might know enough about the different signs that while I don't know exactly which sign maps to the action of interest, I know it is not contained within this sequence. Therefore, I know that the play is not on. Or on the contrary, I don't know exactly which sign maps to the action of interest, but I know it is contained within this sequence. Therefore, I know the play is on. And you can see how, to a lesser degree, this is information that a coach might not want the other team to know about their system, but it is something that's not quite as strong as knowing exactly which sign is on. And so our first key result is that there is basically a best way to decode signs. And not to give Dr. Dahbura too much praise, but it's actually pretty similar to basically the strategy that he kind of roughly described to me at the outset of the project, which is that each sequence carries some information, and as the observer, when we were able to pair it with the resulting action that took place on the next pitch, it gives us even more information. And so what do we know? We know that, for example, if a steal happened, then the sign for a steal was in that sequence. And if nothing happened, then a sign for the steal was not in that sequence. And you see I add an asterisk here because obviously some sign systems have the capacity to put a play on multiple pitches in advance. And that's something that's not covered in sort of our simplified framework, but it is a limitation that I will discuss a little bit later on. But so what is the best way to keep track of this information over the course of the game? And we found that it was to basically partition all of the signs that the coach could possibly give, which we refer to as the alphabet, into two partition sets. The suspect set, which contains all of the signs that we haven't ruled out as the key yet, and the null set, which contains all of the signs that we have ruled out as the key. And so these sets are complements of each other, right? If I've ruled out the nose as a steal sign, then it won't be in my suspect set for steals. And so, as you can see, this basically for the observer becomes a matter of set operations. So, after observing a sequence and then observing what happens on the next pitch, you update your suspect list either by, if nothing happened, you would remove all of the signs from your suspect set. And if something did happen, you would want your new suspect set to be only the signs that occurred both in this sequence and the ones that you had already, and the ones that you haven't yet ruled out. So if I've ruled out the hat brim, for example, I wouldn't want to then add that back into my new suspect set. I'm going quickly here. Hopefully this part makes sense, but feel free to stop me if you have any questions about how this is working. And so having established an optimal decoding strategy, our approach for establishing an upper bound is that, given this optimal algorithm for decoding, how can the sender optimally respond with a strategy of their own? And so if we can develop both of these strategies and prove that each are the most effective at carrying out their own job, then if you play out the strategy using these, or if you play out the game by using these two strategies, you will basically arrive at a bound, an upper bound on the number of sequences that the coach can give for the sender before the observer starts to obtain this UUI that we've talked about. Well, I think part 2. And so a key result is that there's always a sequence that the sender can transmit such that the observer can rule out exactly one additional sign, except for on the first sequence. And this is a bit of a technical point, but to try and summarize, constructing a sequence for which only one sign can be ruled out relies on the availability of already eliminated signs to act as basically decoys in the new sequence. And so on the first sequence, no signs have been ruled out, so none of those eliminated signs are available to us. And so that's why the cost is so much higher after the first sequence. And so to really quickly run through how the bound is constructed, we start with n suspects, one for each of the possible signs. We rule out however many were given in the first sequence. We refer to that as M. And then we can rule out exactly one in each subsequent sequence. And so we are left with one possible suspect, which is kind of, when the game ends, that's when the observer can say with confidence, oh, this is the key, after n minus m sequences. And so that's how we arrived at our bound. Ongoing work. So I mentioned earlier, or showed earlier with the diagram, how the observer can gain information from each sequence, but there's an underlying assumption there, and that is that the sender and the receiver are always transmitting information to each other correctly, which, as we've seen, isn't always the case in baseball. So just to kind of elaborate, if the coach gives a steal sign, but the base runner doesn't steal, well, the player and the coach may have known that they messed up, but the observer won't know that. And so they've taken this information to be about the sign system to be true, when in fact there's actually been a mistake. And so hopefully you can kind of see how an error like this happening is going to derail the process of decoding pretty quickly. And so one of the things we were tasked with was creating some kind of allowance for the possibility that maybe a handful of errors are going to occur over the course of a game. And the way that we decided to tackle that was through error tolerance. And what error tolerance is it's basically an arbitrary number, but it assigns a number of strikes to each individual sign. And so rather than having to eliminate a sign only once, you may have to eliminate it 2 or 3 times to give yourself a higher degree of confidence that that your results are accurate. And so obviously there is a trade-off here. In order to have this confidence, it's also going to take much longer to hone in on the key itself. And so how important that trade-off is to the observer is kind of up to any coach who wants to steal signs. And then the second part is are simulations that I'm working on. And so what I'm basically doing there is I'm simulating coach behavior, ranging all the way from completely random selection of signs to basically following the optimal transmission strategy that we've outlined to a T, and hopefully, highlighting just how much more utility a coach is able to gain from their sign system without having to change it, if they were only to either follow our rules or follow a handful of them that will really help preserve the life of your sign system, if you will. Because that's ultimately, what the hope of this project was not to aid future sign stealers, but rather help coaches illustrate or help coaches transmit their signs in a much more efficient way. And then finally, just a couple of limitations that I like to mention since they might come up as questions. Our decoding algorithm generalizes very well to many of like the indicator-based systems. So maybe an indicator and then the following sign or the following two signs or something like that. But it currently struggles with what I like to call dynamic sign systems, which are things where the meaning of signs change based on most commonly a game state, like the number of outs is something that you could see commonly used. And so that's something that we're still working on, is how to deal with those.
Or hidden sign systems, right, Jack? Like, complete misdirections, like, it's not the touches at all. It's where the third base coach is standing in the box, or the number of times they look at the ground or something like that.
Exactly. And yeah, that is all I have. Hopefully you all enjoyed, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Go ahead.
I have one, and I may have a misunderstanding of this, but I assume that the teams, particularly major league teams, would change their signs from game to game. And if that's the case, the analysis would have to be, a conclusion would have to be reached early in a game, would it not, to be of value?
Yes, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the results is actually that you can, how should I phrase this? You find that they're actually start to reveal information unless they're very cautious relatively quickly. One thing that we haven't really addressed quite as much is just that, when it comes to bunts and steals, they are, and maybe this is more what you're getting at, but they're pretty infrequently used over the course of a game, right? Maybe, I think the last time I checked, things like that may occur on only 1% of pitches. So that would be your biggest concern, is that the coach just really isn't putting enough plays on for you to get any significant or consequential amounts of information over the course of the game. And then also, as you mentioned, if a coach does something like change their signs from game to game, that's going to make it even harder.
But unless the third base coach is incredibly clever, which is not, they're not thinking about the optimal strategy here. As I suspected for a long time, you can start to gain information from, if you're paying attention to the sign sequences, very quickly. And also it's important to note that you gain information, you gain even more information when there's not a sign than when there is a sign, almost. So, if a coach is out there busy flashing a bunch of signs, and there's no bunt, no steal, nothing, then by the time something happens, I've found in practice, and I think our system validates, that you are in a good position to say, something's going on here. So, it's very interesting, and hopefully the one of the goals of this talk is that at the next baseball game you go to, your friends around you will say, you know, you were just fascinated with the third base coach the entire game. What is up with that? So hopefully this will give you some motivation to watch the third base coach.
Another question. How about if the runner or batter either bunts or steals on their own without getting a sign?
Yeah, the dreaded green light. Yeah, it's dreaded.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. I think, you know, in it's not an error, obviously, because they're acting of their own accord, but that's almost an example of what our analysis would classify as an error, where nothing in the signs that were transmitted actually corresponded to what happened on the field, right? Because they may have given a bunch of random signs and then the batter decided to steal because the coach told him before the game or before the start of the inning that if he got on first, he had the green light. And so that's an example of that kind of mismapping between the signs and the actions, which we've assumed in this analysis to kind of be the only thing that matters. But yeah, another good point.
Why don't we, if there are additional questions, why don't we hold off until the end? So you have some time to think about it. I want to make sure that we have time for the rest of the projects that we were hoping to share with you tonight. So thank you, Jack. So I'm going to turn it over to Tad and Justin, and I don't know how you're planning to present, but I'll introduce both of you. Tad is a computer science and econ major at Hopkins. He'll be working with the Nationals front office doing analytics this summer. And he's previously conducted projects for the Ravens and the Orioles and even the University of Maryland women's softball team in sports analytics. And he's also a sports writer for the Johns Hopkins newsletter and the published author of What's the Right Career? So that's Tad. And Justin is a junior at Hopkins studying computer science and applied math and statistics. He's also on the Hopkins baseball team, and he's involved in software engineering as well as his data analytics work. He's been part of our group for the past 2 years and has worked on projects including pitcher clustering and punt analysis for the Ravens, as well as base stealing analysis. So gentlemen, go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for the introduction, Dr. Dahbura. So we're going to just start sharing our slides. I'm going to take it that everyone can see our screen. So we called our project Grouping for Predictability, basically clustering batted balls and using these clusters to project next year weighted on base average. So without further ado, let's jump in. So we all know the traditional accounting system of baseball. It's kind of an intuitive accounting system. You know, yeah, there are a few more categories that are on the screen, but more or less we classify things as a walk, a single, a double, a triple, a home run. And it's really convenient and intuitive, right? Like, you know, a walk, single, double, etc. When you see it, it's very intuitive to the average fan of the game. And that's great when it comes to a box score, but when it comes to actually projecting performance, something that's very valuable to Major League Baseball teams, we were wondering, could you define a more predictive accounting system? So trading in the intuitiveness of walk, single, double, et cetera, for some predictive group 1, predictive group 2, and so on. So that's kind of what our project set out to do. And I think a logical question that comes off of that approach is, so how do we actually determine these predicted groups? So our determination of these two predictive groups very much gets broken down into 2 key tasks. The first one is to actually design the groupings. So basically using a combination of variables to design 5 groupings into which we can classify every batted ball. The second key task at play here is to determine the predictive power of each of those 5 groupings. So basically how important each of these clusters is. And then we kind of use these 2 tasks together to identify the best combination of groupings and their associated weights. So I'll turn it over to Justin.
And right, so as Tyler mentioned, our first task was to establish those kind of predicted groupings that we want to replace the kind of intuitive system. And so we started with just purely pitch by pitch data. And from that, we pulled our batted ball data. And we were able to get this from Baseball Savant and StatCast. And so this had kind of all the metrics of the batted ball and also some of the incoming pitch metrics. So like velocity, induced horizontal break, induced vertical break, things like that, that we actually did end up using later on. And so from there, we are designing these 5 groups that will basically cover all those batted balls and will allow us to bucket each instance of a batted ball that, you know, player X, player Y hits over the course of a season. And then from there, we went to task 2, which was basically finding those, or the importance or the weighting of each of those clusters. So player X has 100 balls in, for example, group 1. How much of that are we going to apply in our prediction of next year's WOBA? And so we had to figure out that kind of significance or the importance of each group in order to determine our prediction for the following year. And so that kind of played into how significant each grouping was. And kind of as an aside, we're trying to stay away from too much of our technical aspects from here, but for our prediction aspect, we did use a linear regression here. Obviously, you could use other models. You just have different ways of accounting for an instance in group 1, group 2. But for kind of our project for now, we decided to use just linear weights to get our projections. So kind of as a overview, we start with our pitch by pitch data. And so in our project, in our instance right now, we have 2019 pitch by pitch data, and we get from there to basically a XWOBA projection for every single batter for their 2020 season. Obviously 2020 was a short season, but we found that it was still relatively predictive. And so to do that, we have the clusters that we defined before, and then the weightings to how each player performs with respect to those clusters in order to create our model.
Yeah, so just to follow up on what Justin said there, the reason we're using 2019 is it's like the last full non-shortened season for which we have another season's worth of data to kind of benchmark our results against following it. And with that as a backdrop, we wanted to switch from kind of telling you about our approach to what we actually found. So going back to task 1 and kind of the results of it, what were the actual like optimal groupings based on the variables we used? We found that the best cluster, the highest performing cluster, basically equated to 2 kind of pitch specific metrics in terms of the spin, and then also 2 kind of, we'll call it bat specific metrics in terms of the launch speed and the launch angle. And one thing we wanted to just highlight here, just as kind of a rough backdrop for what these clusters look like, if you see kind of the 5 sets of colors on this visual you see here and how they're heavily clumped in several areas, in particular, kind of those like 3 almost trapezoidal shaped entities you see in the center, you can see how we have kind of different ranges of launch speed and launch angle that map to each cluster. Now, in terms of kind of the results of that second task we outlined, we got our weights for each group in terms of their predictive importance. Obviously, I don't expect the numbers in orange on the screen to have any like great intuitive meaning other than the fact that it just shows that like our second group had a little more predictive power than the others. But let's actually put this in a way that is useful and, you know, we can derive insights from. One question that I think warrants asking is, did this approach actually work? And our answer is actually a comfortable yes. So if you just looked at weighted on base average in year end, so in the current year, and then you compared it to, you used it to project a given batter's weighted on base percentage in the subsequent year, you'd be able to explain about 38% of the variation in that next year weighted on base average. So not horrendous, but not particularly good, like especially when you're an organization making investments in players, you'd like a little more than 38% of the variance explained. But using our approach, we were able to get that kind of the amount of variance we could explain up to 48%. So basically we found that our approach in clustering delivers about 10% in added value on the model at the surface. And then Justin and I also went in and did some normalization based on number of plate appearances to the data. And for some years, we were even able to get that up to about 62%. So we think there is actually grounds here and that this was quite an effective methodology. Now to probably what we would consider the most fun part of our presentation. We wanted to look at who our model actually thought was really good. And keep in mind, again, this model was run on 2019 data to project 2020 data. And as we outlined earlier, But we were pleased to tell you that we might have the #1 model in the nation for projecting Josh Van Meter's weighted on base percentage or weighted on base average performance. We got his right to 4 decimal places. But all jokes aside, we looked at this list and we were pretty happy with it. There are a number of players that we were literally getting, as you can see in that model versus actual column, to like 4 decimal places, which is, we were very happy with that. But I think a more useful insight to look at than just kind of what were our most accurate projections in terms of the difference between the players weighted on base average in 2020 and what we projected their weighted on base average in 2020 to be is in the cases of players who saw a noted improvement or got significantly worse between 2019 and 2020, were we actually able to project that they would get better or worse? And like any model, we were not able to do that for every player, but we actually found that there were quite a few players for which we were able to project significant changes in their weighted on base average between the years effectively. So one of our kind of best projections on that would be Josh Bell. But we also, I mean, if you look through this list, another one that really stuck out to us was Tim Anderson, and that we were able to project that he would basically go from being like a good player to more of a star type of player as projected by his weighted on base average. But we looked through this list and we thought it was really interesting and also really a good thing that we were able to project a number of notable changes in weighted on base average using our model. Now, I've shown you the great fun sides of our model, what it got really, really right. It would also not be fair if I didn't show you what our model got really, really wrong. So on the next slide, we'll look at some of the players we missed most on. I am very embarrassed to say, as someone who is going to start interning with the Washington Nationals, that our model performed worst on Juan Soto in a very non-flattering light. Although we were very convinced that Juan Soto is still indeed, in fact, a wonderful baseball player. But one thing that I think will stand out if you look at this list as of the players we performed worst on is, Soto, Harper, Tatis, Acuna. You see a lot of players on here who are really, really established stars, right? There is a disproportionate amount of star power on this list. And I think on the surface, that might not seem like a good thing, but Justin and I were actually kind of quite pleased that this was a list of the worst projections. And I think there are kind of 2 ways to think of it. One, maybe a slightly more intuitive way, which is you don't need another model to tell you Soto, Harper, and Tatis are good baseball players. We have the eye test, we have plenty of stats for that. But the way I would really think through this is a lot of models actually do not perform well in star players, because you can think of star players kind of definitionally by the fact that their stars being far on a tail of a distribution, and that the model is very much concerned with how can I get this projection right for the larger populace or kind of the meat of the distribution rather than anyone on either extreme. So we looked at this list and actually kind of saw it as we're not missing on any players where we don't currently have enough insights, and that of the players we're missing on, they're on far ends of the distribution, and we are really projecting well for the vast majority of the populace, which when you look at the free agent market and trying to find bargains and things like that, that's really where your value is going to come from. That wraps up our presentation. Justin and I also wanted to acknowledge Sig Mejdal of the Baltimore Orioles, who kind of gave us the idea for this project and has been a valuable mentor throughout the process. Thanks so much for your time.
Any questions on that? While you're thinking of questions, I wanted to say the way I think of this, and I think the way Major League Analytics offices are thinking, is moving away from the fixation on the box score and looking, we all talk very informally about, oh, the guy had a lot of lucky hits or things like that, and really looking at metrics away from the box score level that indicate the potential performance level of players, how well they hit the ball. If the guy rakes, he rakes. If he barrels up, he barrels up. Of course, they're always the blind squirrel swings, but overall, we all know talented players are going to hit the ball well consistently. And so, I believe that what Tad and Justin have been working on is a big step in that direction, and not really paying as much attention to where the ball lands. It's really about sort of at a different level in order to improve predictability.
Tony, to support that, I think you see a lot of changes now with batting coaches. Teams now have 2 or 3 batting coaches that tend to be younger, more analytically driven, and certain teams are seeing great results as a result, including my San Francisco Giants, who had 241 home runs from a bunch of guys you would never expect to hit 241 home runs.
Yep. So with that, I want to make sure that we have time for a couple more concepts to send your way. I'm going to talk a little bit about our baseball scheduling, and I'm going to try one more time. I'm trying to get it out of presentation mode. Is this better? Is this the full screen that you see or not? Not really? No. Okay. Well, let's see. Here we go. So around 1993, I was sitting in Fenway Park with the traveling secretary for the Detroit Tigers, and I was just spacing out. And at one point I said, gee, must be a really interesting math problem to figure out how to do a baseball schedule. And he said, yeah, that must be an interesting math problem. And about 2 weeks later, he called me up and he said, Major League Baseball has a real scheduling problem, and they need you to go down to New York and work with them. So that's what got me started on my fixation with baseball scheduling. And it turns out that it is a fascinating and very difficult math problem to get a good schedule. Maybe you haven't thought about it. There are lots of challenges with baseball compared to basketball, football, and so forth. Namely, teams play every day. They play lots of games. So as I said, I worked with Major League Baseball for a while, worked with the South Atlantic League, and then we expanded our operations when I came back to Hopkins, because I started out my career at Hopkins. And so there's a lot that rides on a good schedule, and different leagues like different things. Some leagues like to have a week in, a week at home, a week away. Other leagues in the lower levels don't like to have too many consecutive home games because of fan fatigue. And so they like to have a choppier schedule and so forth. Sometimes leagues like to have, say, the Yankees at the Orioles this week, and then the Orioles at the Yankees the following week. And sometimes they don't. And it varies almost by year. So if you look at the South Atlantic League, minor league scheduling is especially challenging because most teams except for AAA, it's bus travel, as we know, the notorious long bus trips. And so it makes it really difficult to just, you can't just arbitrarily schedule and expect teams to be able to show up. I'm not going to get into the technical details too much, but it turns out that this is a very large, complicated, or can be viewed as a very large constraint satisfaction problem that's basically integer programming. And there are some ways to attack the problem mathematically, and things have come along quite a bit in the last decade or so. But if we look at toy problems have a few constraints. Let's say you're trying to maximize profit in a factory, but scheduling problems have thousands of variables and thousands of constraints as well. And you have to have integer solutions to these mathematical problems. You can't end up with with your solution saying that a team should be half on a given day, half in this ballpark and half in another ballpark. So this belongs to a really nasty set of math problems. And in fact, if there were efficient ways to solve the baseball scheduling problem, you could solve a lot of problems in all kinds of fields. The world would be a different place, in fact. So we've come a long way in 10 years or so with better software, more sophisticated software, faster computers, and novel modeling techniques. And so we're really taking advantage of that, especially because the scheduling problems aren't growing. So if we make our solution methods faster, we can sort of catch up with the ways to solve the problems. The other thing is that there are no perfect schedules. You may have heard that in the past. In fact, Katie Feeney is quoted when she was, she's passed, unfortunately, but when she was alive, she would always be interviewed in April when, the Cubs would be playing in Wrigley Field and there would be a foot of snow on the ground. And the reporters say, why are the Cubs playing in Wrigley Field, in April? And she would say, there's just no perfect schedule. So the schedules, it turns out, are full of trade-offs. And so I like this for our students because it's a great real world experience to work with people who, and there's just no pure mathematical solution for these problems. So we take a schedule to a league, whether it's the president, a scheduling committee, and so forth. And they say, oh, we really like this, but we hate this. Can you give us more of this and less of that? And then we iterate. And sometimes we iterate dozens of times until we find a trade-off, a balanced schedule. And so here's kind of a schedule that we developed, and you can see that, for this league, it's actually pretty good. This is an old South Atlantic League schedule where teams have decent homestands and then some road trips, and it's a very smooth schedule. So we've made a lot of advances over the years. And it's really by combining the best of the human scheduler and the computer. By the way, in 1993 or so, this is literally how the schedules were generated by a couple, the Stevensons on Staten Island. There's a 30 for 30 documentary about them. I believe it's online if you're interested. And they would sit outside on their picnic bench with charts and things and come up with a schedule that kind of worked. But after a while, just baseball needed more. So that's where the computers came in. And you can see, just to somewhere along the line, there are lots and lots of constraints down to how to begin and end the season, July 3rd and July 4th, splitting the home and away so that teams can be home for firework shows on either the 3rd or 4th of July in a lot of leagues, travel patterns, team-specific constraints. I'm always reminded this week of the Masters. In the South Atlantic League, Augusta could not be at home during the Masters. Similarly, Indianapolis couldn't be home during the Indy 500, and Louisville couldn't be home during the Kentucky Derby, and so forth. And so across the country, we had a really good idea of all of the different sort of the cultural events that were going on, from NASCAR races to city festivals and things like that, because everything impacted baseball schedules. So the status is that, as you know, Major League Baseball took over the minor leagues, and they took over the scheduling. And coincidentally, scheduling was simplified to have 6-game series, one per week with Mondays off for the most part. And that may be changing in the future, and things will get harder, and we're here. But in the meantime, we're working with MLB. We're doing all of the umpire crew schedules for the affiliated minor leagues. And we're also shifting our attention to the independent leagues. And there are some really cool technical problems, some challenges ahead, such as integrating the game scheduling and the umpire crew scheduling, so that you come up with a schedule that's good for the teams and also good for the umpire crews. I'm working with a group on using reinforcement learning, which is a form of AI, to try to, just like a chess game, to figure out a good schedule. And finally, kind of the holy grail for a lot of leagues is to incorporate the potential for revenue earning into a schedule, so that teams have schedules that are pegged to revenue potential. We've made some inroads there until we had the major disruption with MLB. But for example, Myrtle Beach liked to have a lot of home games in the spring, but a lot of other teams didn't. You know, Myrtle Beach could pack their ballpark with spring break kids and people on vacation. And so we could kind of tilt the schedule a little bit to give Myrtle Beach a few more home games in the earlier part of the season and so forth. So I think that there's still a lot of potential there that's yet to be uncovered. So that's scheduling. It's a great problem. We love it. We love doing scheduling at Johns Hopkins. I'm going to pivot a little bit in the remaining time to talk a little bit about outfielder positioning optimization, which is another one of my fascinations. When I was part of the Hagerstown Suns and Tony Tarasco was the hitting coach, we used to muse about different ways of testing outfielder ranges, looking at hang time and positioning. And so when Tony became the outfielder coach and the base running coach for the Mets last year, we kind of put that to the test. And we came up with a system for doing that, for positioning outfielders against particular hitters. And so what we do is we take a bunch of previously batted balls for a given hitter. And typically for starters, you know, over the course of a couple of seasons, you get 100 to 200 balls that are classified as fly balls to the outfield or line drives. We look at the hang time, we look at where at the XY coordinates, and fortunately all of these are in StatCast or Baseball Savant, I guess. And then we also can weight them by how long before today they were hit. So balls that were hit a couple of seasons ago might have a lower weight. And then we consider the particular outfielders. We consider their startup time. We develop a profile, their startup time, their cruising speed, and then we look at the direction relative to the landing spot. And for each of those balls in the past, we assign positions for the outfielders. And then we say, okay, if the outfielder was playing there, would they have been able to catch that ball? Or would they have been close enough to hold it to a single, or is it a double? Triples are unlikely, and then home runs, of course, you don't have to worry about. So, and we assign a weight. And then based on that, we come up with optimal positioning by moving the outfielders around in the program in different positions and see where the best positions would be for them to field all of those balls over a period of time. And we move them around, let's say 5 feet at a time. And we do, you know, maybe 5,000 different iterations within boxes. We don't do crazy configurations, kind of, you know, more or less where they would play. What we found is that the results are pretty accurate, close to actual distances. The side-by-side positioning is what varies the most and is kind of counterintuitive. And this is one thing I'd like you to take away, just something to think about. Because if you have, let's say you have a bunch of balls hit in one area, let's say over here, and then a few scattered over in, you know, different area. Most people intuitively would say, well, put the outfielder where that big cluster of batted balls would land. But it actually, we think of it differently. We think of placing the outfielder outside of that cluster enough so that they could still reach those balls, but they could also cover more than that. So I look at it, you know, when an outfielder is camped under a ball, most people say, wow, he was positioned perfectly. Good job, everybody. I look at it and I say, that's inefficient. He should have had to run to that ball because he still could have covered more terrain. So it's, you know, it's kind of just a different way of looking at it, that we're looking for coverage, not trying to be in the center of a dense cluster. The Mets on the bench had spirited debates about this during games, according to Tony. Half of the coaches were progressive and kind of appreciated it, and half were traditionalists and, you know, wanted to have outfielders camped under fly balls. So, but nonetheless, one thing that was I found was really interesting, and here's an example for Bryce Harper against right-handed pitchers, and you can see that the center fielder is shaded over towards left field. Not surprisingly, the right fielder is deep, and so on. What Luis Rojas, who was the manager last year, when he was shown this, he got really excited and he said, "This is what we need." The analytics was part of it, but what he saw was the visual aspects. So, you know, for my students and for everyone, I say never minimize the visual effect, because he said, look, you know, I don't want to see a top view of where the outfielder should be positioned. I'm not on top of the stadium. And so something like this really helps me a lot more, even from the dugout, to show me where the outfielder should be positioned. This is Ronald Acuna Jr. And you can see the number of balls there that we use in the training set. And so this is interesting because this is against right-handers, this is against left-handers, smaller sample size, so it's a little risky, but nonetheless, you know, that's what we were going with. So there's a lot of future work here. So in closing, I'll just say that we really have to work. What we've been doing more recently is clustering by pitcher type. You know, if someone is up against Jacob deGrom versus some other kind of junk ball pitcher, you know, the position that's going to affect how the hitter, you know, where the batter hits the ball. We also have been working on adjusting those past batted balls by weather factors such as wind, temperature, and humidity. And it turns out that it does make a difference. I thought I was wrong. I thought that everything would even out in the end, but what we found is that we do need to be careful about wind-blown balls and things like that. My goal is to develop a website where anybody can go, an open website, enter the hitter, Bryce Harper, the pitcher type. So, you know, pitchers like, you know, Scherzer, and then specific outfielders with their profiles to view the optimal positioning. And then maybe even have something fun, like include, you know, if you had followed our advice for today's game, this is what would have happened, and compare it to the real deal. So we have a lot of fun, and we find utility in what we do, and we like to think that the work we're doing is appreciated by different organizations as we build our reputation. So with that, I think hopefully we have time for a couple of questions. We blasted a lot of information at you. Yes, Bruce?
In the very first presentation, I was very interested in everything that was covered. But what wasn't covered is the fact that you may be building intel on each individual player and that player's ability or struggle to follow signs that are given. I can imagine that if you had such a rating, Manny Ramirez might rank low, and Cal Ripken might rank high, for example. Because some players are more rebellious against sign as well. You know, for example, I don't know, who would you can picture certain players that would just say, "I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to sacrifice. I'm not," and would ignore signs and screw up your system.
You're right. I hadn't thought of that. But yeah, maybe it's a silver lining to the coach of the players not following his signs as well. He's throwing off.
Right.
But yeah, that's funny. That's not something we've discussed at all.
We should also add that this week is the official launch of, I think it's called PitchCom. It's not for the third base coaches, but it's for the catchers and pitchers and some of the fielders, you know, using buttons and, you know, and and audio in the caps to transmit the pitch. Most of you have probably heard of that. So, our work is more focused. I think it's more interesting from the third base coach perspective, and maybe one day, in our Jetsons world, it will, the signs will go by the wayside. But for the moment, it's just one of those other interesting aspects of the game that many casual fans don't appreciate. But it's one of those things when, people tell me baseball is such a slow game. And I say, are you kidding? There's so much going on. I can't keep up. What are you talking about?
Right.
I thought it was also really interesting that they are giving those or some receivers to some of the position players as well. Because I think that's something that people forget is that like position players will also adjust slightly based on the pitch. Like if it's just the catcher and pitcher, like your shortstop can't shade one way or the other because they wouldn't know. But they're actually, I think it was 3 position players besides the pitcher and catcher who get receivers as well. So I thought that was also pretty interesting.
They're actually approved that for the regular season.
Yes. Yeah, I think 6 teams are going to be using it this week. Yeah, just like that.
Why wouldn't everybody use it?
Yeah, and they don't even know yet. Some pitchers may not want to use it. Others will. I think it's just going to be a transition. But to the point about the fielders, fielders definitely, especially great fielders do know how to adjust for the pitch, and great hitters are paying attention to the fielders as well. So a lot going on out there.
Pat and Justin, I have a question for you. Do you have any feel for why you were so off with Soto? Did you ever look back and see what was maybe
it's a good
cause
question.
for that?
It's a good question, and I think that we really do believe the tail of the distribution argument is probably what's at play there, and probably at play there in a good way. I have a second theory, which is perhaps a kind of offset of our approach, which is we're attempting to project weighted on base average, but we're doing it entirely through batted balls. And as a result, walks really aren't in our model. And obviously Juan Soto is quite prolific at walking. So I think that could potentially be a future improvement. I think that could also kind of be some evidence as why Harper's second on that list as well, is that we're not quite integrating the impact of walks quite as much. The nice thing on that is like, that's something with more time that could be resolved rather than like a foundational issue.
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, that's one thing I almost like about the fact that like we had those, like Ty was mentioning, we had a lot of stars in a miss category, is that it's a somewhat consistent miss in a way, which means that it's something you could probably tweak in our model, which I think I agree with that. I think because a lot of those stars probably, get pitched around more, they have higher walk rates. I think that's kind of what plays into that a lot as well.
I'll conclude with a story about Soto and Bryce Harper. Both played in Hagerstown. They're 2 of my boys. And Harper was here first, of course. And so when Soto was here, the running joke was he'd come up to me and he'd say, Shag. I was known as Shag by the players. They never knew my real name probably. And he'd say, Shag, who has the best swing you've ever seen? And I would pretend to think a moment. I go, Bryce Harper. And he'd go, oh, and he'd go off. And then the next night he'd do the same thing. I feel terrible. I think he was taking me much more seriously than I intended, but who knows, maybe I motivated him. So if I see him today, I'll tell him, hey, look, I'm really sorry. I'm going to declare it a tie.
I've never seen a player that young have such a great eye.
Yeah, he was really something to see. He was a delight to have at Hagerstown, and, just to hear the coaches talk about him in glowing terms, pretty special.
With respect to that pitch sign, that's going to be what, the catcher, the pitcher, and I think the shortstop or the second baseman, they're all going to have something on.
And the center fielder.
catches and middle, yeah.
Mhm.
And that's going to start tomorrow.
Yep. Yeah, who said baseball was a conservative sport? So with that, if there are no other questions or comments, thank you very much for allowing us to share the work that we're very passionate about. I think you can kind of tell, and that we enjoy so much. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you, Tad, Justin, and Jack also for your participation tonight. Very informative and very interesting. And who would have believed that all this was happening in Baltimore?
Well, Baltimore,
Right, Peter?
Baltimore has a storied history of being very advanced in analytics, right? Going back to the early, the Hopkins professor who wrote maybe arguably the first book on analytics. Peter Cook,
Yeah.
I think his name was.
Yeah, that goes all the way. That's way back.
Yeah,
Earnshaw
he's-
Cook.
Earnshaw Cook.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Earnshaw Cook. Yeah.
thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right, guys,
Have a good evening.
hopefully we'll see you at the convention this summer.
And
Looking
the other
forward
thing
to it.
is, for those of you who are in the chapter, we're going to be going to a Hopkins games on Saturday, April 16th. You should have all got an announcement, and just let me know if you're going to attend. We've got 3 or 4 people already going.
You'll see the other side of Jack and Justin.
Yes.
And if you steal a sign or two, let them know.
Excellent.
Okay. Thank
Thanks,
you very
everyone.
much, guys.
All right, guys, have a good night. Much appreciated.
Okay.
Thank
very
you for
good.
having us.
See you again.
Bye.
Bye.